The tray came out of the kitchen at exactly 8:51 on the 4th of July, and I remember the time because I looked down at my watch out of habit, the way I always did when something was about to go wrong. 7 grandchildren sat around the long cedar table on my parents' dock, sparklers still smoking in a bucket by the rail, the lake behind them turning the color of a bruise as the sun went down. And one by one, the caterer set down a whole lobster, split and butchered and glistening with butter, in front of one grandchild after another. Sophia, Grant, Mason, Ruby, Wyatt, Bella. 6 plates, 6 lobsters, $200 each, ordered 3 weeks in advance from a seafood company in Traverse City that my sister Vanessa had bragged about in the family group chat, like she'd personally caught them herself. Then the caterer got to my daughter. He looked down at his clipboard, then up at Vanessa, who was standing at the head of the table in a white linen dress, holding a glass of rosé like a scepter. "Ma'am, I only have 6 lobster orders on the list. There's a 7th child here." He nodded toward Emma, my 8-year-old, sitting very still in her seat with her hands folded in her lap the way I'd taught her to do in church. Vanessa didn't even lower her voice. "Oh, that one gets the chicken tenders. She's on the kids' menu." She smiled at the table, at her husband Marcus, at our mother, like she'd just said something clever instead of something cruel. Then she looked at me, and she said the sentence I would hear in my sleep for 3 weeks straight. "Some of us have lobster money, Claire. Some of us just have leftovers." The table laughed. Not everyone. My brother Todd stared hard at his plate, and Todd's wife Priya reached over and put her hand flat on the table like she was bracing herself. But enough of them laughed that the sound of it rolled out over the water and came back to me twice. I watched my daughter's face do the thing children's faces do when they understand they've been humiliated before they understand why. Her chin dropped. Her shoulders came in. She looked down at the plastic basket of chicken tenders that landed in front of her like it was a verdict. I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that, because everything that came after started in that silence. But I did not swallow it whole either. I looked up at the caterer and asked him, politely, what it would cost me to have a 7th lobster brought out tonight. He checked his clipboard a second time, apologetic, and told me the order had been placed 3 weeks in advance, 6 of them, paid in full, and that there was no 7th lobster on the truck. So I reached over, and I took my daughter's hand under the table, and I said, quietly, but clearly enough for the people nearest us to hear every word of it, "Emma, there is nothing wrong with your dinner. And there is nothing wrong with you." And then I looked at my sister, and I smiled the exact smile she'd used on me 100 times over 30 years, and I said nothing else at all. Because 3 weeks later, my sister was going to find out exactly whose leftovers had been keeping that lake house standing for the last 2 years. And she had no idea it was coming. If you've ever sat at a family table and felt smaller with every course, you already know how this story goes. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, down in the comments, because I promise you, by the end, you're going to want to say something. My name is Claire, and I need to back up, because none of what happened on that dock makes sense unless you understand what my family thought they knew about me versus what was actually true. 3 years before that dinner, my husband Daniel died on a Tuesday morning on the on-ramp to Route 31, hit by a delivery truck whose driver had been awake for 19 hours straight. I was 39 years old. Emma was 5. Daniel owned a small custom furniture company called Hollis and Finch, 6 employees, a workshop that smelled like sawdust and linseed oil, and a set of hand-built dining tables that had just started getting written up in regional design magazines right before he died. Everyone in my family assumed that when Daniel died, his little furniture shop died with him, and that I, the quiet sister, the one who'd majored in art history and married a carpenter instead of a doctor like Vanessa had, was left with nothing but a mortgage and a grieving kid. That is what they believed for 3 years. It was not true, and I let them believe it, because grief does strange things to pride, and because somewhere in the middle of planning my husband's funeral, I discovered something about myself that I had never had a chance to discover before. I was good with numbers. Genuinely good. Daniel had always handled the business side of things while I handled the house and Emma. And when he died, I inherited a business I barely understood. 11 open contracts, a line of credit I didn't know existed, and a workshop full of employees who were about to lose their jobs. So I taught myself. I sat at our kitchen table every night after Emma went to sleep with a laptop, a stack of library books on small business finance, and 11 months of bank statements. And I rebuilt that company from the studs up, the same way Daniel used to rebuild a chair. I renegotiated supplier contracts. I found out one of Daniel's oldest employees had been quietly stealing lumber for 2 years, and I fired him without flinching. I took the design magazine attention and turned it into a custom order wait list 11 months long. 10 months after Daniel died, Hollis & Finch was profitable for the first time in its history. Weeks after that, a boutique furniture group out of Chicago offered to buy the company outright. Workshop, waitlist, name, and all. I sold it for $1.1 million. Nobody in my family knew. Not my mother, not my father, not Vanessa, not Todd. I never told them, and I want to be honest about why, because it matters to everything that happened later. I didn't hide it out of some grand strategic plan. I hid it because for as long as I could remember, my family had a role for me, and the role was the one who struggles. Vanessa was the golden one, the one who married a real estate broker and lived in a house with a wine cellar and posted vacation photos with captions about gratitude. Todd was the peacekeeper, the one who avoided conflict by disappearing into his own small life. And I was the cautionary tale, the one my mother mentioned in a tone of practiced pity at every holiday. Poor Claire, doing it all on her own. I had spent 39 years being underestimated in that family, and somewhere in my grief, I think some small, wounded part of me decided that being underestimated was safer than being seen. So when the money came in, I didn't buy a bigger house or a new car. I put most of it into a trust for Emma's future, kept a modest condo, kept working part-time as a bookkeeper for 2 small local businesses just to stay busy and stay invisible, and I quietly, privately, became the person who solved my family's problems without any of them knowing my name was on the check. It started with my father. 2 years before that lobster dinner, barely a month after the sale of Daniel's business finally closed, my dad Frank had a stroke in his garage while refinishing a canoe paddle. And by the time my mother found him, he'd lost partial use of his left side and most of his short-term memory reliability. He recovered well, better than the doctors expected, but the hospital needed to know who held power of attorney for his medical and financial decisions going forward, in case it happened again. There was a very awkward family meeting in a hospital waiting room, fluorescent lights, bad coffee, and my mother turned first to Vanessa, because Vanessa was the golden one, and surely the golden one should hold the responsibility. Vanessa said she was simply too busy. that Marcus needed her for his business dinners, that it wasn't a good time. My mother turned to Todd. Todd said he wasn't good with paperwork, and he didn't want that kind of pressure. Then my mother turned to me, the one nobody had expected to want it, and she said, almost apologetically, like she was handing me a chore nobody else wanted, "Claire, would you mind?" I said yes before she finished the sentence, not because I wanted the burden, because he was my father, and because nobody else in that waiting room was going to say yes, and somebody had to. I signed the paperwork 3 days later at a lawyer's office in Grand Rapids. Durable power of attorney, both financial and medical, for Frank Whitmore. Executed and notarized. Filed with the family attorney, a quiet, careful man named Arthur Blevins who had handled our family's affairs since before I was born. Nobody thanked me. Nobody mentioned it again. Vanessa posted a photo 2 days later of herself bringing Dad a fruit basket at the hospital with the caption, "Family is everything." And it got 400 likes. And I sat in the corner of that same hospital room holding actual legal responsibility for my father's life, and nobody in that comment section knew my name. That was the pattern of my whole family, if you want to understand it in one sentence. Vanessa performed love in public. I carried it in private. And for 2 years that arrangement held, quietly, invisibly, the way a foundation holds up a house nobody thinks to look underneath. The lake house is the second thing you need to understand, because it is the house the whole rest of this story is actually about. My parents bought that place on Blackwater Lake in 1987, back when a modest 3-bedroom cottage on 40 feet of shoreline cost what a used car costs today. Every summer of my childhood happened on that dock. Every 4th of July, every graduation, every anniversary, every quiet Sunday morning with coffee and loons calling across the water. It was, without exaggeration, the only place my entire scattered, complicated family ever reliably came together and behaved like they actually loved each other. When my father had his stroke, my parents were 71 and 67, living on a modest pension and Social Security, and they had made a decision 6 years earlier that none of us kids knew about until the hospital forced the family's finances into the light. They had refinanced the lake house to help cover a bad investment my father made, a friend's failed marina venture, and the new mortgage payment was $3,000 a month, a number that had been manageable when my father was still consulting part-time, and became catastrophic the moment he couldn't work at all. I found out because Arthur Blevins called me, not my mother, not Vanessa, me, because I was the one holding power of attorney, and the mortgage company needed to speak to someone with legal authority about a missed payment. I remember sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot, listening to Arthur explain, in his careful lawyer's voice, that the lake house, the actual physical place where every good memory in my family had ever happened, was 2 payments away from a formal notice of default. I didn't tell anyone. I called the mortgage company myself that same afternoon, set up an automatic payment from an account under my maiden name, Whitmore Holdings, a small holding company I had formed the week the sale of Daniel's business closed, and I brought the loan current within 11 days. Then I kept paying it. Every single month for 2 years, $3,000, quietly leaving my account and landing in a mortgage servicer's system with no name attached that anyone would recognize as mine. And yes, I thought about simply paying the loan off outright. I had the money sitting right there. I didn't do it for 2 reasons, and both of them still hold up. It was not my house to pay off, and a payoff that size would have surfaced in my parents' file with my name printed on it inside of a week. And then everyone in that family would have known exactly what I had. My mother believed, because I let her believe it, and because my father's memory of the arrangement was foggy after the stroke, that the house was being paid through a small investment account of theirs that had, in her words, finally started performing again. Vanessa believed the same thing when she thought about it at all, which was rarely, because Vanessa didn't think about where money came from. She only thought about where it went. My brother Todd never asked, because Todd had learned a long time ago that asking questions in our family usually got you assigned a chore nobody wanted. For 2 years, I paid for the place where my family gathered to feel like a family. And for 2 years, that family gathered on that dock and called me the one who struggled. I want to be fair here, because I think fairness matters even in the telling of your own wound. My parents were not cruel people. My father, before the stroke slowed his tongue, used to call me Steady Claire in a voice that I chose for years to believe was affectionate. My mother loved me in the particular, complicated way some mothers love the child who reminds them of their own insecurities, at arm's length, with conditions attached that she probably couldn't have named herself. It was Vanessa who turned condescension into a sport. It was Vanessa who needed, in some hungry, unexamined way, to have someone in the family who was doing worse than her, so that her own choices could feel like triumphs instead of just choices. And after Daniel died, I became that person for her, permanently, gratefully, conveniently. The widow, the struggling one, the charity case, though she hadn't used that exact word out loud until the night of the Lobster. Emma had asked me, 3 weeks before that 4th of July, why Aunt Vanessa always looked at us like we smelled bad. I remember laughing, a short, surprised laugh, because an 8-year-old had just described in 11 words something I'd been circling for 11 years. I told her Aunt Vanessa loved us. She just showed it in confusing ways. And I hated myself a little for saying it, because I didn't believe it. And Emma, sharp as her father had been, knew I didn't believe it either. So that was where we stood on the evening of the lobster dinner. 6 grandchildren getting $200 dinners ordered 3 weeks in advance with real thought and real care. Care my sister was fully capable of when she wanted to perform it. One grandchild, mine, getting a plastic basket of chicken tenders and a public line about leftovers, delivered with a smile in front of everyone, while the woman who had personally kept the ground under that entire scene from being repossessed sat there and chose deliberately to wait. I looked around that table while the laughter died down, at my mother, who laughed a beat too long and then looked away, at my father, whose face I couldn't quite read anymore since the stroke, at Todd, who wouldn't meet my eyes, at Priya, whose hand was still flat on the table like she was holding herself down. And I looked at my daughter, eating chicken tenders with her back very straight, refusing to cry in front of people who wanted to see it. I made a decision on that dock, in that silence, while the sparklers finished smoking out in their bucket. I decided I was done being the foundation nobody thanked. I did not decide yet exactly what that meant, but something in me that had been quiet for 2 years stood up very calmly and did not sit back down. We left before dessert. I told my mother Emma had a headache, which was a lie, and my mother, who has never once in my life pushed past a convenient lie I offered her, said, "Of course, drive safe," without asking a single question about the thing that had just happened at her table. I buckled Emma into the back seat of my car, and as I pulled out of the gravel drive, I watched the lake house shrink in my rearview mirror, glowing warm and gold against the dark water, every light in it running on power that I paid to keep connected, every mortgage payment that had ever kept it standing coming out of an account with my name quietly attached to it. Emma spoke first, from the back seat, in the small, careful voice she used when she was working up to something hard. "Mom, are we poor?" I nearly had to pull the car over. I looked at her in the mirror, this steady, watchful little girl who had lost her father at 5 years old and never once complained about it, and I said, "No, baby, we are not poor, not even close." And she looked out the window at the dark trees going by and said, in a voice that was trying so hard to sound like it didn't matter, "Then why does Aunt Vanessa always say we are?" I didn't answer her right away. I just kept driving, both hands steady on the wheel, watching the dark tree line blur past the headlights. Because some questions from an 8-year-old deserve more than a reflex answer. And that one deserved the truth. Eventually. Just not yet. Not at 10 o'clock at night on a 2-lane road with her still buckled into a booster seat behind me. When we got home, I ran Emma a bath, because that was our ritual after hard days. Warm water and lavender soap, and the particular quiet that settles over a child once the adrenaline of a bad evening finally drains out of her. She didn't cry in the bath. She never cried right away, not since Daniel died, and I used to worry about that. Worry that she'd learned too young to hold things in the way I had, until a school counselor gently told me that some children simply process grief and hurt on a delay, the way thunder arrives after lightning, and that the delay itself wasn't the problem to solve. I sat on the closed toilet lid while she soaked, and I watched her trace shapes in the condensation on the tile, and I thought about how much she looked like Daniel when she concentrated like that. The same small crease between the eyebrows, the same stubborn tilt of the chin. I tucked her in at 10:40 in the small blue bedroom of our modest 2-bedroom condo, the one my family had visited exactly twice in 3 years, both times remarking, kindly enough on the surface, on how cozy it was, a word I had learned to hear as code for smaller than what you used to have. I sat on the edge of her bed for a long while after I turned off the overhead light, only the little star-shaped nightlight glowing in the corner, and Emma looked up at me in that dim gold light and asked me the second hard question of the night. "Was Dad rich, Mom?" I told her the truth, the way I always tried to with her, scaled to what an 8-year-old could hold. I told her that her father had built something wonderful with his hands, that he wasn't born with money, that nobody in our family had ever really had much of it, but that he'd worked so hard and been so good at what he did that by the time he died, he'd built something worth a great deal. I told her that after he was gone, I had worked hard too, to keep what he'd built alive, and that we were, in fact, quite comfortable. More comfortable than almost anyone in our family knew. She was quiet for a long moment, chewing on that the way she chewed on most things, carefully, from every angle. And then she asked the question that I think, looking back, was the real turning point of that entire evening, more than anything Vanessa had said at the table. "Then why do you let them treat us like we're not?" I didn't have a good answer for her in that moment. I told her it was complicated, which is what adults say when the true answer is uncomfortable, and she accepted it the way children accept most unsatisfying adult answers, with a small nod and a request for one more song before sleep. I sang her the same 3 verses I'd been singing since she was a baby, an old, half-remembered lullaby Daniel's mother used to sing to him. And by the second verse, her eyes had gone heavy, and by the third, she was asleep, one hand still loosely curled around the stuffed rabbit that had been hers since her first Christmas. I sat there in the dark for a long time after her breathing evened out, longer than I needed to, because I wasn't ready yet to go be alone with my own thoughts in the next room. Eventually, I went into the kitchen, made a cup of tea I didn't really want, and sat down across from the one photograph I kept on the counter instead of packed away in a box. Daniel in the workshop, mid-laugh, sawdust in his hair, taken maybe 8 months before the accident. I talk to that photograph sometimes, quietly, in a voice I would have been embarrassed for anyone else to hear. That night, I told him what his daughter had asked me. Why do you let them treat us like we're not? And I told him I didn't have a good answer, and I told him I was starting to think I needed to find one. Because the truth was, this had never been only about the lobster. I want to tell you about a piano recital, because I think it explains more about my family than almost anything else I could describe. I was 11 years old, and I had practiced a Chopin prelude for 4 months for the spring recital at the community center. Badly at first, then adequately, then, by the week of the performance, genuinely well. Well enough that my teacher had pulled my mother aside afterward one lesson and told her I had real promise, if we could find the money for better instruction. Vanessa, 14 at the time and already fully formed in her particular talent for making other people's moments about her, had a dance recital scheduled for the exact same weekend. A conflict our mother resolved the way she resolved most conflicts between us for the next 30 years, by quietly prioritizing whichever daughter's disappointment felt louder in the moment. My mother came to my recital. She sat in the 3rd row, and she watched me play the entire 4 minutes and 12 seconds of that Chopin prelude. And when I finished, she clapped. And then, before the applause had even fully died down, she leaned over to the woman next to her and said, in a voice just loud enough for me to hear from the stage, "That's lovely, but you should see her sister dance. She's really something." I was 11 years old, and I remember standing there on that little community center stage in my good dress, hands still trembling slightly from the performance, hearing my own mother tell a stranger that my sister, who wasn't even in the room, was really something, while I, standing right in front of her, apparently was not. I never played piano competitively again. Not because I stopped loving it, but because some small, wounded part of 11-year-old me decided that being good at something only mattered in my family if Vanessa hadn't already claimed the spotlight for that particular category of achievement first. It is astonishing, looking back now as a grown woman with a daughter of my own, how early that pattern set itself into my bones, and how long I let it steer the entire shape of my adult life, right up until a caterer set down 6 lobsters and a basket of chicken tenders and called it fair. There was one person in my life, back then, who never once made me feel like leftovers, and I think about her often, especially on nights like that one. My grandmother, Daniel's grandmother actually, not my own blood, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, who had taken to me the moment Daniel first brought me home, and who used to say, every single time I visited her narrow little house on the edge of town, the exact same sentence, delivered like a blessing. "There you are, the real one." Just that. There you are, the real one. I never fully understood what she meant by it until years after she'd passed, sitting at that same lake house dinner table being handed a basket of chicken tenders in front of my own daughter, and I finally understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that Ruth had seen something in me that my own family never had. Some steadiness, some realness, that she considered worth naming out loud, again and again, until I might eventually believe it myself. She said one other thing to me, near the end, that I did not understand at the time and have not been able to put down since. I had been complaining, lightly, the way you complain about people you have decided to keep loving anyway, about how much running my own family expected me to do at the holidays. And Ruth set down her tea and put her hand flat over mine on that scarred little kitchen table and said, "Sweetheart, being useful to people is not the same thing as being loved by them. Some families will keep you for 50 years without ever once actually looking at you." Ruth died the year before Daniel, quietly, in her sleep, at 86. And I still keep one of her old cast-iron skillets on my stove, seasoned black and heavy and perfectly balanced, because using it feels like being told one more time, there you are, the real one. I thought about her that night too, sitting at my kitchen table with cold tea and Daniel's photograph and my daughter's unanswered question hanging in the air. I thought about what Ruth would have said if she'd been at that dock and heard my sister call my daughter's dinner leftovers. I think she would have stood up, small as she was, and said something quiet and devastating. And then she would have looked at me, waiting, the way she always waited, patiently, for me to finally stand up too. I sat there for a long time that night, turning over every version of what I could do next. Part of me, the old part, the 11-year-old on the recital stage part, wanted to simply let it go the way I always had, to decide that confrontation wasn't worth the discomfort, that keeping the peace mattered more than being seen. But another part of me, a part that had gotten stronger every year since I'd sat at that same kitchen table rebuilding Daniel's company out of nothing, kept circling back to my daughter's small, serious voice in the back seat of the car. Then why do you let them treat us like we're not? I did not have an answer for her that night, but I had 3 weeks to build one. 21 days. That is the whole distance, it turns out, between the worst night my daughter had ever sat through and the best hour of my life. I have thought about that a great deal since. Everything I needed was already in a drawer in my kitchen. All I had ever lacked was a reason big enough to open it. The days right after the lobster dinner were quiet on the surface. That is the first thing to understand about how I operate, and it is the thing my family has never understood about me at all. I do not do my most important work loudly. I did not call Vanessa and scream at her. I did not post an angry message in the family group chat. I went home, I put Emma to bed, and I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I did what I had trained myself to do for 2 years, every time something in my family's finances went wrong. I got very, very organized. I want to walk you through what that looked like because it matters. It matters because everything that happened 3 weeks later was not luck, and it was not a sudden fit of rage. It was a plan, built quietly, brick by brick, out of documents I already had and a few I still needed. The first thing I did was pull up the account I'd been using for 2 years, the one under Whitmore Holdings, and I printed every single mortgage payment I had made since the day Arthur Blevins called me in that grocery store parking lot. 24 payments, $3,000 each, $72,000 in total that had kept my parents' lake house out of foreclosure while I sat at family dinners being called the struggling one. I laid the printouts out on my kitchen table in neat rows, like evidence, because that is exactly what they were. The second thing I did was call Arthur Blevins. I hadn't spoken to him directly in almost a year, not since the last time a mortgage question came up. And when I told him I needed to schedule a meeting to review the full scope of my power of attorney and my parents' financial situation, there was a pause on the line, and then he said, in that careful voice of his, "Claire, I've actually been meaning to call you. There's something you should know." He told me that 2 months earlier, without my knowledge and, more importantly, without any legal authority to do so, Vanessa had contacted him directly and asked about the process for selling the lake house. She'd told him our parents were getting older, that the upkeep was becoming a burden, and that the family had discussed putting the house on the market and splitting the proceeds. Arthur, being a careful and ethical man, had told her that any sale would require the consent of both owners of record, my father and mother, and that given my father's stroke, it would also require sign-off from whoever held his power of attorney. Vanessa had asked who that was. Arthur told her it was me, and according to Arthur, there had been a long silence on the other end of the phone, and then Vanessa had said, "That has to be a mistake," and hung up. I sat very still at my kitchen table when Arthur told me that part, because it meant something important. It meant that 2 months before the lobster dinner, my sister had already been quietly planning to sell the house that I had spent 2 years secretly keeping alive, without telling me, and possibly without telling our parents the full picture either. Because Arthur mentioned that her questions had focused heavily on how quickly a sale could close, and how the proceeds would typically be divided among the family. Not what our parents wanted. How fast it could happen, and how the money would move. That was the second discovery, and it landed harder than the first. This wasn't only about a childish comment over Lobster. This was about a sister who had, behind the backs of both her parents and her sibling, started laying the groundwork to liquidate the one place our family still gathered, likely to fund something in her own life that I didn't yet understand, and who had been so confident that I held no real power in this family that she hadn't even bothered to check whether I could stop her. She was wrong about that. Over the following days, I started asking careful, casual questions, the kind that don't ring alarm bells. I called my mother under the guise of checking in about Dad's physical therapy schedule, and in the middle of the conversation, gently, I asked whether anyone had talked to her lately about the house. My mother's answer told me everything. She said, in a slightly too bright voice, that Vanessa had mentioned, just mentioned, that with property values on the lake up so much this year, it might be smart to think about their options down the road. Nothing decided, just something to think about. I asked if Vanessa had said anything about who would get what. My mother laughed a small, uncomfortable laugh and said Vanessa thought it made sense for the money to be split based on, and I quote, who's actually built something with what they've been given. Which was, I understood immediately, a polite way of saying Vanessa believed she deserved more of the proceeds than I did, because in her mind, I had built nothing. The daughter who had rebuilt her late husband's failing business from a kitchen table and sold it for over $1 million. The daughter who had personally paid $72,000 to keep the exact house in question out of foreclosure. That daughter had built nothing, according to my sister, because my sister had no idea what I'd actually built and had never once bothered to ask. I called Priya next, my brother's wife, because out of everyone at that lobster dinner, she was the only one whose face had told me she was as disturbed by what happened as I was. Priya and I had never been especially close, mostly because Todd kept his distance from family conflict and Priya, by extension, kept a polite distance from me. But when I called her and simply said, carefully, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest with me, she didn't hesitate. She told me that at a family barbecue 3 weeks before the lobster dinner, one I hadn't been invited to, which hadn't bothered me at the time because Emma had a dentist appointment that afternoon anyway, and I'd assumed it was just a small, last-minute gathering, Vanessa had floated the idea to Todd and Priya of restructuring things with the lake house, and had specifically said, and Priya remembered the exact phrasing because it had upset her enough to bring it up to Todd afterward in the car. Claire's never going to be able to help with the upkeep anyway, so it's not like she's losing out on much. Priya didn't stop there. I could hear her take a breath on the other end of the line, the particular kind of breath a person takes when they've been carrying something and are finally about to set it down. There's more, Claire. I wasn't going to say anything because it isn't really my business, but you asked me to be honest, so I'm going to be honest. She told me that Marcus's brokerage, the one he'd built his whole reputation on, the one that funded the wine cellar and the vacation photos, and every gesture Vanessa ever made toward looking like the Golden family, had lost 2 major commercial listings that spring, and that Marcus had been overheard at that same barbecue on the phone with someone, pacing along the tree line at the edge of my parents' backyard, talking in a low, tight voice about a bridge loan and a deadline. Priya said she hadn't thought much of it in the moment. People have money troubles, it happens. But looking back now, with everything I'd just told her about the calls to Arthur Blevins, it started to look like a pattern instead of a coincidence. I sat very still with the phone against my ear, doing the kind of arithmetic that a year of rebuilding Daniel's company had trained into me without my even trying. A struggling brokerage, a husband pacing the tree line about a bridge loan, a wife suddenly, urgently interested in how quickly a house could be sold and how the proceeds would be divided. It didn't take much imagination to see the shape forming underneath all of it. Vanessa wasn't simply tired of the upkeep on a lake house, the story she'd been telling our mother. Vanessa needed money, quickly and quietly. And the fastest, easiest source of money in our entire family was a piece of property she assumed, wrongly, was sitting there, half neglected, propped up by our aging parents' fictional investment account, ready to be liquidated the moment she found the right angle. I sat there for a moment longer, letting the shape of it settle fully before I let myself feel anything about it. Because there was another piece of this that Priya's information had just clicked into place for me, something I hadn't let myself think about clearly until that exact second. This was not the first time my sister had gone looking for a fast, quiet source of money when her own life outpaced her own resources. It was simply the largest and the boldest, and the first time it had ever pointed directly at something that was, in every way that mattered, mine. I thought back to the spring after my father's stroke, almost 2 years earlier now, to a conversation I'd nearly forgotten, because at the time it had seemed like nothing more than an awkward, slightly tone-deaf suggestion at a difficult moment. Vanessa had shown up at my parents' house one afternoon with a folder of her own, a stack of forms from the bank, and had suggested, gently at first and then with growing insistence when nobody immediately agreed, that it would be simpler, going forward, for her to be added as a joint signer on my parents' primary checking account. Her reasoning had sounded almost generous on the surface. She lived closest. She could run errands, pay bills quickly if something came up, save everyone the hassle of waiting on paperwork during an emergency. My mother, exhausted and frightened in those first weeks after the stroke, had nearly agreed on the spot. It was Arthur Blevins, in the end, who had quietly steered that particular request into a dead end, explaining to my parents in his careful lawyer's way that adding a joint signer to a checking account was a much larger legal step than it sounded like, one that would give that person full, unrestricted access to withdraw funds without any oversight at all, and that given the seriousness of what the family was navigating, it might be wiser to formalize things properly instead, through an actual power of attorney, reviewed and executed with full legal safeguards. That conversation was, I understood now, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone against my ear. The very same conversation that had eventually led to me holding that authority instead of Vanessa. At the time, I had assumed Vanessa's interest in that checking account was simply her usual instinct to be seen managing the crisis, to be photographed, in effect, holding the folder of forms. I had never once considered that it might have been the first quiet attempt at exactly the kind of access she was still, 2 years later, trying to find a way toward. I said as much to Priya, laying it out for her the way I would have laid out a discrepancy in a client's books, calmly, in order, fact by fact. There was a long pause on her end of the line, and then she said, slowly, like she was working something out in real time herself, "Claire, I don't think I ever told you this, because it felt like gossip and I didn't want to start anything. But Vanessa mentioned something to me privately, maybe 8 months ago, about how frustrating it was that, quote-unquote, everything with your parents' finances had gotten so complicated and locked up since the stroke." She used those words, locked up, like it was a vault someone had sealed her out of on purpose. I felt a small, cold click of recognition at that phrase, locked up. because it told me something important about how my sister experienced the world. To Vanessa, the careful legal architecture Arthur and I had built to protect our aging, vulnerable parents wasn't protection at all. It was an obstacle, a door that had been shut in her face for reasons she had never bothered to examine too closely, because examining them honestly would have required her to sit with the uncomfortable fact that nobody in that room, 2 years earlier, had trusted her the way they trusted me. She had spent 2 years, it seemed, quietly resenting a lock she didn't understand the reason for, rather than ever once asking herself why it existed. "There's something else," Priya said, and I could hear, even over the phone, the particular hesitation of someone deciding whether a detail was worth adding or whether it would sound petty. About 3 weeks before the barbecue, Vanessa had a real estate friend of hers, a woman named Denise, who does listings up near Traverse City, over for coffee. I wasn't there. Todd mentioned it because Denise apparently asked him a few questions about the lake house while she was there. Casual questions. How many bedrooms? When was the roof last redone? That kind of thing. Todd thought it was strange at the time, but you know Todd, he filed it away instead of asking about it. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing it. A friend over for coffee. Casual questions about bedrooms and roofs. The exact preliminary conversation a person has before quietly gathering comparable sale prices on a property they don't yet legally have any right to sell. It lined up perfectly with the title search Arthur would later tell me about, the one filed under Vanessa's married name, and it told me that this plan had been moving for months, not weeks, longer and further along than even I had first suspected when Arthur called me with it. I asked Priya if she remembered anything about numbers, any figure Vanessa might have mentioned, out loud or in passing, about what she expected the house to sell for, or what her own share might come out to. Priya thought about it for a long moment. Not a number exactly, but she did say something once, at Easter I think, about how property on that stretch of Blackwater Lake was going for $600,000 and $700,000 now, 20 times what your parents paid for it back then. She said it kind of wistfully, like she was doing math in her head. I did that math myself later that same night, after Priya and I had said our goodbyes, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, because that was simply how my mind had learned to process a threat, by quantifying it until it stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like a problem with a solvable shape. Comparable properties on that stretch of shoreline, based on recent listings I found with a little searching, were indeed closing in the high 600s, better than 20 times what my parents had paid in 1987, and that was before you accounted for the improvements, the remodeled kitchen, the new dock, the roof. All of it improvements that had happened, I now realized with a small, bitter twist of irony, largely during the 2 years I had been quietly keeping the mortgage current. Because a house that isn't at risk of foreclosure is a house its owners can actually afford to maintain. I had not just kept the lake house standing. I had, indirectly, made it more valuable, more attractive, more exactly the kind of asset a woman with a struggling husband and a bridge loan deadline might look at and see, not a family home, but an exit. I sat with that thought for a long time that night, longer than I probably should have, watching the numbers I'd written on the legal pad blur slightly in the kitchen light. There was something almost darkly funny about it, in the way that only the truest, saddest things in a family are ever actually funny. That the very effort I had made to keep my parents safe and comfortable, quietly, invisibly, for 2 years, had also been the effort that made the thing my sister wanted to take from them worth taking in the first place. I had built the very foundation she was standing on to plan its own demolition. I picked up the phone again before I let myself think too much further into that particular spiral. Because I had learned, over 2 years of solitary, late-night ledgers, that grief and anger left unchecked in the small hours had a way of curdling into something less useful than clarity. I called Priya back. "Does Todd know any of this?" I asked. Priya was quiet for a moment. "Some of it. He knows about the bridge loan comment. He doesn't know I told you. He's been avoiding the whole subject because you know how he gets. He'd rather pretend a storm isn't coming than stand outside in the rain and get wet with the rest of us." I understood that about my brother better than almost anyone. Todd had spent his entire life mastering the art of being technically present for a crisis without ever actually participating in it, and I had, for years, resented him for it in a quiet, unspoken way. The same way I resented my mother's silences and my father's slow retreat into whatever peace he could find after his stroke. But resentment, I was learning that summer, was a much less useful tool than information, and Priya was handing me information. "There's one more thing," Priya said, and her voice dropped. "Careful now. The way people get careful right before they say something they've been sitting on for a long time." At the barbecue, before the bridge loan comment, before any of that, Vanessa said something about you specifically. About Emma, actually. Sophia had asked why Emma wasn't there that day, and Vanessa said, and I remember this because it made me so uncomfortable I had to walk into the kitchen, she said, "Claire's daughter is sweet, but let's be honest. That whole side of the family has been living on borrowed time since Daniel died. Somebody's going to have to catch them eventually." I felt something cold settle low in my stomach, hearing that sentence repeated back to me in Priya's careful, apologetic voice. Living on borrowed time. Somebody's going to have to catch them eventually. My sister had said that about my daughter, about my dead husband, about the family I had rebuilt with my own 2 hands out of grief and spreadsheets and 11-hour nights at a kitchen table. And she had said it as though catching us was some act of grace she was preparing to perform, rather than a story she had simply never bothered to check against reality. I thought of the folder of mortgage statements sitting untouched in a drawer in my own kitchen at that very moment. $72,000 of borrowed time. Except it wasn't borrowed at all. It was mine. Every dollar of it. "Claire," Priya said, quieter now, "are you okay?" I told her I was fine, which was mostly true and mostly a reflex, the same reflex I'd used on my mother for 30 years. And Priya, to her credit, didn't push. She simply said, "For what it's worth, Todd and I don't believe any of that. We never have. I think you should know that, whatever you decide to do." I thanked her, genuinely, because in a family built almost entirely out of performance, a small, private, unglamorous act of loyalty like that one meant more to me than anything Vanessa had ever posted with 400 likes attached to it. Before we hung up, I asked her one more question, mostly out of instinct. The same instinct that used to make me double-check a supplier invoice even when the math looked fine at first glance. I asked her when exactly Vanessa had started planning the lobster dinner, the one at my parents' 4th of July gathering. Priya paused, thinking. "She mentioned it at that same barbecue, actually. Said she'd already called the seafood company in Traverse City that week to lock in a delivery date, because apparently they book up fast for the holiday." I did the math in my head, slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to do it over 2 years of forensic patience with numbers that didn't want to add up. The barbecue where Vanessa discussed selling the house behind my back and made her comment about my family living on borrowed time had happened the same week she called that seafood company to order 6 lobster dinners for 6 specific grandchildren, deliberately, in advance, with enough planning to know exactly which children would be receiving $200 of celebration and which child would not. It hadn't been a thoughtless oversight at a busy family gathering. It had been planned, arranged, ordered in advance, the same week she was quietly trying to arrange the sale of a house I had spent 2 years secretly keeping alive. My sister had built an entire evening of humiliation around my daughter with the same organizational precision she'd used to plot cashing out our parents' home. And both plans had been running on the exact same false assumption: that I had nothing, that I was nothing, that whatever happened to me or to Emma wouldn't really cost her anything, because people who live on borrowed time don't get a say in how the story ends. "Thank you for telling me all of this," I said to Priya, and I meant it more than the words could really carry. I needed to know it before I decide what happens next. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked down at my own hand resting flat on the kitchen table, steady, not shaking, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I already knew the answer, even though I hadn't consciously decided it until the exact moment she asked. "I'm going to find out exactly how much rope she's given herself," I said. "And then I'm going to let her use every inch of it." We said our goodbyes a few minutes later, Priya promising to call if she heard anything else, me promising to keep her updated, both of us understanding, without saying it directly, that we had just become allies in something neither of us had fully named yet. I set the phone down on the table beside the folder of mortgage statements, and for a long moment, I simply sat there in the quiet of my kitchen, the refrigerator humming, Emma's nightlight glowing faintly down the hall, and let the full shape of what I'd just learned settle over me. I sat with that sentence for a long time after I hung up the phone. Claire's never going to be able to help with the upkeep anyway. My sister had said that sentence out loud, to my brother and his wife, believing it completely, 2 years into me personally covering every single mortgage payment on that house, $72,000 of my own money. Money she had no idea existed because I had never once corrected her assumption that I was the struggling one. For the first time since Daniel died, I understood with total clarity that my own instinct to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to let my family believe the smaller, easier story about who I was, had cost me something. Not money. I hadn't cared about the money in the way people usually mean that. It had cost me being seen, and it had allowed a version of me to exist in my family's imagination that was small enough for them to plan around, to plan against, without a second thought. That was the moment the plan stopped being defensive and started being deliberate. I want to be careful here, because I think it would be easy to tell this next part of the story as if I turned into someone cold, someone who stopped caring about her family and started only calculating. That is not what happened, and I think it matters to say so plainly. What happened is that I stopped protecting people who were actively working against my daughter's future and started protecting my daughter's future instead. Those are very different things, even though from the outside, for a little while, they can look the same. The next morning, I called my father. Not my mother this time, my father, because despite the stroke, despite the fog that sometimes settled over his memory, there were still mornings when Frank Whitmore was entirely, completely himself, sharp and warm and steady, and I had learned to catch those mornings when I could. He answered on the second ring, his voice clear, and I asked him, gently, if he had a few minutes to talk about the house. There was a long pause on the line, and then my father said something that surprised me so much I had to sit down. He said, "I know it's you, Claire." I asked him what he meant, and he said, quietly, almost embarrassed, The mortgage. I know the payments have been coming through fine. Better than fine, for years now. And your mother thinks it's the investment account, but that account hasn't earned real money since before my stroke. I do the math sometimes, even if I don't always say what I've done. I've known for a while it was probably you. I just didn't know how to bring it up without either of us having to say it out loud. I sat in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, and I cried for the first time since the lobster dinner, quietly, so Emma wouldn't hear from her room down the hall. My father, in his slow, damaged, still entirely present way, had seen me clearly for years, and had simply been waiting, out of some old-fashioned mixture of pride and love, for the right moment to say so. I asked him if he knew what Vanessa had been discussing with Arthur Blevins about selling the house. There was another long pause, heavier this time, and he said, "No, nobody's told me anything like that." And I understood in that moment that my sister hadn't just been planning behind my back. She'd been planning behind our father's back, too, the actual legal owner of the house alongside my mother, treating his stroke as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. That was the last piece I needed. Not because I wanted ammunition against my sister for its own sake, but because it told me the shape of the trap she had unknowingly built for herself, and it told me exactly how I was going to close it. Over the next 6 days, I did 3 things, methodically, without telling a single member of my family what I was doing. The first thing I did was meet with Arthur Blevins in person, in his small, book-lined office above a bakery in downtown Grand Rapids, and I asked him to formally document, in writing, every payment I had made toward the lake house mortgage over the past 2 years, and to confirm in writing, for the file, that as durable power of attorney for my father, no sale, refinance, or transfer of the property could proceed without my explicit written consent, full stop, regardless of what any other family member believed or claimed. Arthur, who had known my family for decades and who I think had quietly respected me more than he'd ever had occasion to say, looked at the stack of mortgage records I brought him and said, simply, "I always wondered how that house kept staying afloat. Nobody in this family ever mentioned you." I told him that was rather the point. The second thing I did was open a private conversation with Priya, who I asked, carefully, whether she and Todd would be willing to support me, not against Vanessa exactly, but in favor of the truth, when the moment came for the truth to be told. Priya didn't hesitate. She told me that she and Todd had been quietly uncomfortable with how Vanessa treated Emma and me for years, but that Todd, true to form, hated conflict so much he'd rather stay silent than risk a fight, and that she'd been waiting for someone to give her a reason to stop staying silent alongside him. I told her the reason was coming. I just needed a little more time. The third thing I did was the hardest, and it had nothing to do with mortgages or attorneys. I sat down with Emma on a Saturday morning, the two of us at our kitchen table with pancakes going cold, and I told her, in language an 8-year-old could hold on to, some of the truth about our family. Not all of it, but enough. I told her that some people in our family had been unkind to us because they didn't understand how strong we actually were, and that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay quiet for a long time while they get ready, and then tell the truth, once, clearly, when it will actually matter. I told her that in 2 weeks, at her grandmother's 70th birthday, which the whole family was gathering to celebrate back at the lake house, some things were going to change, and that I needed her to trust me, and to know, no matter what anyone said to her ever again, that leftovers was never, ever the right word for either one of us. Emma looked at me for a long moment with Daniel's steady, serious eyes, and she said, "Are you going to fix it, Mom?" And I told her yes, I was. The 3 weeks between the lobster dinner and my mother's 70th birthday were the strangest, quietest, most purposeful 3 weeks of my life since the year I rebuilt Daniel's company from nothing. I went to work as a bookkeeper for my 2 small local clients. I picked Emma up from summer camp. I made dinner. I did the things that made me look, from the outside, exactly like the person my family believed me to be. And underneath all of it, brick by brick, I was assembling the truth. I want to walk through this part carefully, because I think this is the part of the story people always assume must have been dramatic, must have involved shouting matches or confrontations, and the truth is the opposite. The most powerful thing I did in those 3 weeks was almost nothing at all. I simply stopped hiding. The first real step was financial, and it started with a decision I sat with for 3 full days before I made it. I decided that the automatic mortgage payment, the $3,000 that had left my account on the first of every month for 2 years, was going to stop. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I had been carrying a burden that was never mine alone to carry, in total silence, while being publicly humiliated by the very people benefiting from my silence. And I had come to understand that continuing to pay quietly, without being seen, without my family understanding the actual shape of the sacrifice I'd been making, wasn't generosity anymore. It was enabling a story about me that was actively hurting my daughter. I did not simply stop the payment and let the house fall into default. I am not a cruel person, and I never wanted my parents to lose their home. What I did instead was call the mortgage servicer and cancel the automatic draft out of my private Whitmore Holdings account. Then I opened a second account, this one in my own legal name, Claire Whitmore Hollis, printed plainly across the top of every statement, and I arranged for the mortgage to be funded from there instead, under written instructions kept on file at Arthur Blevins' office that required my signature, and a copy sent to my parents, before a single payment went out in any given month. In other words, I didn't cut off the money, I made the money visible. For the first time in 2 years, if that mortgage payment was going to be made, it was going to be made with my family's full knowledge and my father's actual authorization, not through some quiet, invisible channel that let everyone keep believing the investment account fairy tale. The second step was legal. I asked Arthur to draft a simple, plainly worded letter on his letterhead addressed to my mother, my father, Vanessa, and Todd, to be delivered the week of the birthday party, laying out 3 facts in careful, unemotional legal language. That I held valid, durable power of attorney for Frank Whitmore, financial and medical. That any sale or refinance of the property at Blackwater Lake would require my written consent as a matter of law. And that the mortgage on the property had, for the past 24 months, been kept current by 24 direct payments of $3,000 each, totaling $72,000 out of Whitmore Holdings, an account controlled solely by Claire Whitmore Hollis. I asked him to hold that letter and deliver it only if I gave the word. The third step was personal, and it was the one that mattered most to me, more than any legal document. I invited my brother Todd to lunch, alone, without Priya, without an agenda he could see coming, and I told him everything. The mortgage, the power of attorney, Vanessa's calls to Arthur about selling the house. The sentence Priya had already told me about, the one about how I'd never be able to help with the upkeep anyway. Todd sat across from me in that diner booth with his sandwich going untouched, and by the end, his face had gone through something I hadn't seen since we were kids, and our own father used to catch him in a lie. He said quietly, Claire, I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know any of this. I believed him. Todd's sin had never been cruelty. It had been cowardice, a lifelong habit of looking away from anything uncomfortable so he wouldn't have to choose a side. I told him this was the moment that habit needed to end, at least once, and I asked him one simple question. When the truth came out at Mom's birthday, whose side was he going to be on? I did not rush him for an answer. I had learned, over the years, that my brother needed room to think in a way the rest of our family never seemed to require. That Todd's silences were not evasions, so much as a kind of slow, careful mechanism grinding through consequences most people processed in half the time. So I sat there in that diner booth, my own coffee going cold in front of me, and I let the quiet stretch. And while it stretched, my mind wandered back, unbidden, to a particular summer afternoon 30 years earlier, one I hadn't thought about in a very long time. I was 12. Todd was 9. We were at the town pool, and Vanessa, 15 that year and already deep into the particular cruelty of teenage self-importance, had shown up with a group of her friends and staked out the good lounge chairs near the deep end, the ones in full sun, the ones everyone wanted. I had been sitting nearby with a library book, minding my own business, when one of Vanessa's friends asked, loudly enough for half the pool to hear, who the girl with the book was. And Vanessa, without even glancing up from her magazine, had said, "Oh, that's my little sister. She doesn't really do anything, she just reads." The way she'd said it, "doesn't really do anything," had landed like a slap, delivered so casually it barely registered as cruelty to anyone but me. And to Todd, apparently, who I hadn't even realized had heard it until years later. He told me, that day in the diner, that he remembered it too, that same afternoon, and that it had actually been the first time he'd understood, at 9 years old, that our family had already quietly decided who each of us was allowed to be. Vanessa was allowed to be everything. I was allowed to be nothing, or at best, a footnote to whatever Vanessa happened to be doing that day. And Todd, watching that whole dynamic unfold from the sidelines even as a small boy, had learned the lesson that would shape the next 3 decades of his life. Stay out of it. Whatever it is, whoever it's happening to, stay out of it. Because the one thing worse than being the sister who doesn't really do anything was being the brother who got dragged into the argument about who did. I used to think I was being smart, Todd said quietly, turning his water glass slowly in a ring of condensation on the table. Staying out of things, not taking sides. I told myself it was maturity, that I was above the drama, that Vanessa and you had some kind of rivalry that wasn't mine to referee. He looked up at me then, and something in his face had gone raw in a way I rarely saw from my brother. But it wasn't maturity, Claire. It was cowardice. I was 9 years old at that pool, and I already knew Vanessa was being cruel to you, and I already knew nobody was going to stop her. And I decided right then that the safest place in this family was nowhere. Not on your side, not against her, just gone. And I've been gone for 30 years. I didn't say anything for a moment because I understood, sitting across from him, that this was the most honest thing my brother had said to me in longer than I could remember. And honesty like that deserved space to breathe rather than an immediate response. I thought about how differently our 2 silences had actually functioned all those years, mine and his, even though from the outside they might have looked the same. My silence had been a kind of armor, a way of refusing to give my family the satisfaction of seeing how much their carelessness cost me. Todd's silence had been something closer to a hiding place, a small, safe nowhere he'd built for himself at 9 years old and simply never found the courage to leave. Dad used to put a lot on you too, I said, finally, because it felt important to say, even in the middle of a conversation that was fundamentally about accountability. You were the only son. I remember him expecting things from you Vanessa and I never had to carry. The lawn, the car maintenance, being the one who'd take care of things when he got older. Todd gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah. And somewhere along the way, I think I decided that if I was going to be the one who takes care of things eventually, the smartest strategy in the meantime was to not get involved in anything that might make somebody mad at me before I actually had to step up. It's a pathetic way to live a life, looking back, waiting for a version of yourself you never actually built. I reached across the table and put my hand over his, the way I hadn't done with my brother since we were children, and I told him that it wasn't too late to build it now, that the version of himself he'd been waiting 30 years to become could simply start existing in that diner booth, in that exact moment, if he chose it. He looked down at our hands for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, some old, familiar retreat losing its grip on him for maybe the first time in his adult life. "What happens to Vanessa?" he asked quietly. "If I actually do this? If I actually stand there next to you at Mom's party and let this come out in front of everyone?" It was, I understood, the real question underneath everything else he'd said, the one that had kept him silent at that pool 30 years earlier and silent at 100 family gatherings since. Not simply fear of conflict in the abstract, but a very specific, very old fear of what happens to a family, to him, to all of us, once the golden child stops being golden in front of everyone who ever believed in her. I told him the truth, because I owed him that much after everything else he'd just given me. "I don't know exactly what happens to her, Todd. I know what's true, and I know I'm done letting what's true stay hidden so everyone else can stay comfortable. But I'm not doing this to destroy her. I'm doing this because my daughter got handed a basket of chicken tenders and called leftovers in front of every relative she has, and because our sister is quietly trying to sell our parents' house out from under all of us to bail out a husband who's in trouble, and because somebody in this family has to finally tell the truth loudly enough that it can't be laughed away over rosé. Whatever happens to Vanessa after that is going to be mostly up to Vanessa. I'm not the one who built the story that's about to fall apart. I just refuse to keep holding it up." Todd was quiet again after that, turning my words over the way he turned over everything, slowly, carefully, weighing costs I suspected went back far further than that single conversation. The waitress came by once to refill our coffee, and neither of us spoke while she did. And after she left, the diner settled back into its low midday murmur around us, silverware and low conversation, and the distant hiss of the soda fountain. Ordinary sounds surrounding a conversation that was anything but. I watched my brother's face while he sat with it, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself simply wait, without managing him, without softening the question to make it easier for him to answer, without doing the thing I had spent my whole life doing in that family, absorbing everyone else's discomfort so they wouldn't have to sit in it themselves. If Todd was finally going to choose a side, he needed to choose it as an adult, standing fully in the weight of the choice, not as a little boy being gently walked toward the answer by his older sister one more time. He didn't answer right away, but 2 days later, he called me and told me he and Priya had decided. They were done staying quiet. I met Arthur Blevins in person the following Tuesday, at his small, book-lined office above the bakery. The same office where I'd first laid out 2 years of mortgage statements like evidence on a courtroom table. He had the letter ready, printed on his firm's letterhead, and he slid it across the desk to me so I could read it one final time before it went into a sealed envelope, waiting for my word. I read every line twice, the way I'd learned to read every financial document twice since the year I taught myself to save my late husband's company. And I found nothing to change. It was clean. It was true. It was, in its own quiet legal language, the most devastating document I had ever put my name to. And it said nothing more dramatic than a series of plain, provable facts. But Arthur had something else waiting for me that day. Something he clearly hadn't wanted to say over the phone. He folded his hands on his desk, the way he did when he was about to deliver news he found genuinely troubling. And he told me that 4 days earlier, his office had received a routine notification from a title company in Traverse City. The kind that gets automatically generated whenever a preliminary title search is requested on a property. A standard first step anyone takes before listing a house for sale. The property in question was the Lake House. The name on the request was V. Whitmore Cole, Vanessa's married name. I sat very still in that leather chair across from him, feeling something settle into place with the cold, final click of a lock turning. She requested a title search, I said, without any authority to sell the property at all. Arthur nodded, his expression grave. She has no ownership interest in that house, Claire. Neither does Todd. The deed is in your parents' names only, and any transaction would require both their signatures, plus, given your father's condition, yours as his power of attorney.
A title search alone isn't illegal. People request them out of simple curiosity all the time, but requesting one, quietly, without informing the actual owners, better than 2 months after telling me herself that the family was considering a sale, tells me your sister isn't simply thinking out loud anymore. She's actively preparing to move, and she's doing it as though the rest of this family doesn't exist. I asked him what that meant practically. Could she actually do anything with a title search alone? Arthur shook his head, careful as always not to overstate the danger. No, not without your parents' signatures, and not without yours. But it tells you her timeline, and it tells you her intentions more clearly than anything else has so far. People who are simply musing about someday don't pay for title searches. People who are getting ready to act do. I left his office that afternoon with a second, colder kind of clarity settling over the first. This was no longer only about a cruel comment over Lobster, or even about a sister who had built her sense of self on the assumption that I had nothing. This was a woman actively, deliberately, moving toward liquidating our parents' home, on a timeline she had chosen without consulting a single person who actually had legal standing to stop her. Confident, right up until the moment I stood up at that birthday table, that nobody in this family would ever notice, let alone object. I had Arthur record the durable power of attorney itself with the County Register of Deeds that same week. A routine step, he told me, one that costs less than $50 and takes about a week to surface in the public record. But that means any title company running a search on that property from that day forward would see, in black and white, that my father's signature cannot move an inch without mine sitting next to it. Then I did one thing myself that same evening. I signed up for the county's property fraud alert, the free notification service any owner or authorized agent can request, so that the moment another document was recorded against that address, my phone would tell me before anyone in my family got the chance to. It took 11 minutes. It cost nothing. And it meant that whatever Vanessa believed she was quietly building toward, the actual mechanism required to finish it now ran directly through me, whether she knew it yet or not. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my father 2 days after that, because I think it matters more than almost anything else that happened during those 3 weeks, even more than the legal architecture Arthur and I were building. I drove out to see him on a Thursday afternoon while my mother was at her book club, and I found him sitting alone on the back porch of their smaller in-town house, the one they lived in most of the year, working slowly through a crossword puzzle with his left hand curled loosely in his lap, the way it had rested since the stroke. He looked up when I came through the screen door, and something in his face told me he'd been waiting for this conversation for longer than I realized. I sat down beside him, and for a while neither of us said anything, just watched the wind move through his small backyard garden, the tomato plants he still insisted on tending himself even though it took him twice as long as it used to. Finally, he set down his pencil and he said without preamble, "Your sister called me last week, asked me a lot of questions about the house, about whether your mother and I had thought more about our options." I asked him what he'd told her. He gave a small, tired smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. I told her I hadn't thought about it at all, because as far as I knew, there was nothing to think about. She didn't like that answer. She kept asking, in different ways, like she was trying to find the version of the question I'd say yes to. He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases like it had been carried around for a while. He handed it to me without a word. It was a photocopy of the original deed to the lake house from 1987, my parents' names printed clean and formal across the top, and beneath it, in my father's careful, slightly shaky handwriting, a note he must have written sometime after his stroke, sometime in one of those clear mornings he'd mentioned, dated 8 months earlier. It read simply, "For Claire, who kept this standing when nobody else was looking. Whatever happens, this house is not for sale unless she agrees. I trust her judgment more than my own these days, and I am not ashamed to say so." I had to look away from him for a moment, out at the tomato plants, because I did not want my father to see me cry on his back porch over a piece of paper that told me, in his own hand, something I had waited 2 years to hear him say out loud. "You've had this for 8 months, I said finally, my voice not entirely steady. He nodded. "I wasn't sure when I'd need to give it to you. I think I always knew, somewhere, that a day was coming when you'd need something in writing, something with my hand on it, not just my word, because my word doesn't always hold together the way it used to since the stroke. I wanted you to have proof that came from me, not just from a lawyer's letter." I folded that piece of paper carefully and placed it inside my bag beside the folder Arthur had prepared. And something about carrying both of them together, the cold legal precision of Arthur's letter and the warm, imperfect handwriting of my father's private promise, felt like exactly the right combination of weapons for what was coming. Not weapons in the sense of harm, weapons in the sense of truth, finally given the shape and weight it needed to be believed. Before I left that afternoon, my father asked me one more question, quietly, almost shyly, in a way that reminded me of the boy he must have been once, decades before I existed. "Are you going to tell everyone at the party? About the mortgage, about all of it?" I told him yes, that I had decided it needed to happen in front of everyone, not because I wanted a spectacle, but because private conversations in our family had a long history of being denied, softened, or quietly rewritten the next morning. And I needed this particular truth to exist in front of enough witnesses that it could never again be argued away. My father nodded slowly, and then he said something I've held on to ever since. "Your mother is going to be embarrassed before she's grateful. That's just how she processes things. Give her a minute to get to grateful. She'll get there. She loves you more than she's ever known how to show, and I think some part of her has always known that too." The days that followed moved strangely, the way time moves when you are waiting for something enormous and trying, at the same time, to keep an ordinary life running underneath it. I went to work each morning for my 2 small bookkeeping clients, reconciling invoices and payroll the same as always, the mundane arithmetic of other people's small businesses feeling almost soothing against the much larger arithmetic I was quietly running in the background of my own mind. I picked Emma up from summer camp every afternoon at 4:15, and we made dinner together. And some nights we didn't talk about any of it at all. And other nights she'd ask, out of nowhere, whether Grandma knew yet, and I'd tell her not yet, soon, and she'd nod and go back to her macaroni like the answer had satisfied something in her that needed periodic reassurance. I met with Todd and Priya twice more during those final days, once at their house after Emma was in bed, once at a coffee shop halfway between our two towns, refining the small, specific role each of them had agreed to play. Todd, to his own visible surprise, turned out to have a talent for logistics once he finally committed to something, quietly confirming the exact seating arrangement for the birthday dinner, making sure Arthur's sealed letter would already be sitting on the table by the time I needed it, coordinating with Priya on when exactly they would step forward to support what I was about to say. Watching my brother finally choose a side after decades of careful neutrality was its own strange, quiet gift, one I hadn't expected to receive in the middle of preparing to dismantle my sister's version of our family. I also spent one long evening writing out, by hand, on a legal pad at my kitchen table, exactly what I intended to say when the moment came. Not a script, not word for word, but the shape of it, the order of the facts, the specific phrases I needed to land cleanly and without hesitation. I practiced it once, quietly, alone in my kitchen after Emma had gone to sleep, speaking the words out loud into the empty room, testing how they felt in my mouth. And I found, to my own surprise, that my voice did not shake once. A year of rebuilding a company from nothing, a year of learning to speak with quiet authority to suppliers and bankers and lawyers who had every reason to underestimate a young widow with a 5-year-old at home, had given me something I hadn't fully recognized until that moment. I was no longer afraid of my own voice. By the time the last details for my mother's 70th birthday were locked down that final week, right down to the cream-colored cardstock place cards with gold lettering, Vanessa's design, naturally, everything I needed was already quietly, completely in place. There is a particular kind of tension that builds in a family in the days before something is about to break open, even when only one person knows it's coming. I felt it every time I talked to my mother on the phone in those 3 weeks, her voice bright and busy with birthday party logistics, guest lists, a caterer, a cake from the good bakery in town. Absolutely no idea that the daughter she was chatting with about napkin colors was quietly holding a folder that could unmake everything she thought she understood about her family. I felt it every time Vanessa posted in the group chat about the party, counting down the days with an exclamation point, still, as far as I could tell, entirely unaware that Arthur Blevins had told me about her calls, still apparently confident that whatever plan she had for that house was moving forward on schedule, with nobody the wiser. She had no idea what was coming. None of them did. And I intended to keep it that way until the exact moment it would matter most. Emma, in her own 8-year-old way, seemed to sense that something large and important was gathering just beneath the surface of our ordinary days. She started asking, every few nights at bedtime, whether it was almost time yet. I told her almost. Soon. I told her that when it happened, I needed her to be brave, and to remember that nothing anyone had ever said about us at that dinner table was true, and that the truth was about to stand up in that same room and speak for itself. She would nod very seriously, the way she'd learned to do things seriously after her father died, and she'd say, "Okay, Mom, I trust you." And every single time she said it, Something in my chest tightened with the particular ache of loving a child who has already learned, far too young, that trust is something you have to choose deliberately, again and again, because the world does not hand it to you for free. The morning of my mother's 70th birthday arrived warm and clear, the kind of blue sky Michigan morning that makes the whole state look like it's auditioning for a postcard. I dressed carefully that day, not extravagantly, but deliberately. I wore a simple, tailored charcoal dress I'd bought 2 years earlier and never had an occasion to use, the kind of quiet, expensive plainness that doesn't announce itself, but doesn't apologize for itself either. I braided Emma's hair myself at the kitchen table, and I told her, looking at her in the mirror, that today she was going to see her mother do something she had never seen her do before, and that whatever happened, whatever anyone said, Emma should just watch and trust that I knew exactly what I was doing. In the trunk of my car, I placed a single folder, dark blue, unremarkable, containing 24 mortgage statements, a formal letter from Arthur Blevins, and a single sheet of paper listing, in plain columns, 2 years of numbers that were about to change everything my family believed about who had been carrying whom. Beside the folder, I placed a small wrapped gift for my mother, a simple bracelet Emma had helped me pick out, because whatever else was about to happen, I still loved my mother, and I still wanted her birthday to feel, in the end, like a celebration rather than a battlefield. I drove north toward Blackwater Lake with my daughter humming quietly in the back seat, and every mile that passed, I felt something in me that had been clenched tight for 3 weeks begin very slowly to loosen. Not because the hard part was over, the hard part hadn't started yet, but because for the first time since that 4th of July dinner, I was driving toward my family not as the quiet daughter hoping to slip through another gathering unnoticed, but as a woman who had spent 3 weeks turning her own quiet strength into something visible, something undeniable, something that was, by the end of that day, going to finally have a name attached to it. They had planned a beautiful party. I'll give them that. The dock was strung with white lights that wouldn't glow until dusk. Long tables draped in pale linen ran the length of the lawn, and a 3-tiered cake sat under a mesh dome on a side table, waiting for evening. Roughly 40 people milled around the yard by the time we arrived. Family, longtime neighbors, my mother's book club friends, all dressed in the soft, celebratory colors of a July afternoon. My mother, in a flowing pale blue dress, moved through the crowd like she'd been born to be celebrated, laughing, accepting hugs, glowing in a way I hadn't seen her glow in years. And for one small, unguarded moment, watching her from across the lawn, I almost let myself hesitate. Almost. Then I saw Vanessa. She stood near the dock in white again, always white, like she was perpetually dressed for a wedding that was somehow always about her, holding court with a small circle of my mother's friends, gesturing expansively toward the lake, and I heard just enough of what she was saying to catch the shape of it. She was telling them how she and Marcus had been the ones to organize the whole party, how she'd handled the caterer, the flowers, the cake, how family, in her words, really does take a certain kind of person to hold it all together. Nobody in that circle knew that the house beneath their feet, the dock they were standing on, existed at all because of 24 payments from an account they'd never heard of. I found Todd near the drink table, and he caught my eye immediately, some silent question passing between us. I gave him the smallest nod. Not yet. Later. He nodded back, and I watched him go find Priya, the two of them drifting closer to where the family would eventually gather for the toasts, positioning themselves, I understood, exactly the way I'd asked. I spent the early part of the afternoon doing something I hadn't expected to do, and it surprised me even as I did it. I spent it simply being present with my daughter. We walked down to the water's edge, away from the crowd, and skipped stones for a while, the two of us alone with the lake and the late afternoon light. And for 20 minutes, none of it, the folder in my car, the letter waiting with Arthur, the 3 weeks of quiet architecture, mattered at all. There was just Emma's laugh when a stone finally skipped 4 times, and the particular gold color the light gets on Michigan water in late July, and the strange, fierce love I felt watching my daughter be, for one afternoon at least, simply a happy child at her grandmother's birthday party, unaware that by the time the sun went down, the entire architecture of how her family saw her mother was going to change forever. Dinner was served at 7, the same long dock table as 3 weeks before, though tonight there was no seafood, just a beautiful catered spread of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables and my mother's favorite potato salad. And I sat where I was placed, near the middle of the table, Emma beside me. And I ate. And I made pleasant conversation with my mother's cousin about her garden. And I waited. The toasts began around 8, as the light started to go soft and gold, and the strings of white lights along the dock flickered on one by one. Marcus went first, Vanessa's husband, raising a glass to the woman who built this family, a phrase that made me set my fork down very carefully. Then Todd, awkward as ever, said a few short, genuine words about our mother's kindness that got a warm laugh from the crowd. Then Vanessa stood, glass in hand, and the whole table quieted the way it always did when Vanessa took the floor. Because Vanessa had spent her whole life training rooms to listen to her. She talked for nearly 5 minutes about our mother's strength, about the family's resilience, about how proud she was of everyone gathered on that dock. And then, near the end, she said the thing that I believe, looking back, was the moment the universe decided it was time. She raised her glass toward the house behind her, toward the warm windows and the string lights and the whole glowing shape of Blackwater Lake, and she said, "And to this house, to all of us who've worked so hard to keep it in the family, no matter what it takes." I stood up. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because it is not something I expect to feel again in my life. I did not stand up angry. I did not stand up shaking. I stood up the way you stand up when you have spent 3 weeks, and honestly 2 years, preparing for a single sentence, and the sentence has finally arrived. The whole table turned to look at me, 40 faces catching the string lights, my mother's smile faltering slightly with confusion, Vanessa's glass still half raised, frozen mid-toast. "I'd like to add something to that toast," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, clear enough to carry down the whole length of the dock. "Because I think it's time this family knew exactly who's been keeping it in the family, and how." Vanessa's smile stayed fixed on her face, but something behind her eyes went very still. "Claire, we're in the middle of—" Vanessa's voice had gone up half a register, bright and brittle, the tone she used when she was trying to steer a room back onto her own script. "This is Mom's night. Whatever this is, it can wait." She looked around the table for support, the way she always had, expecting faces to fall into line behind her the instant she asked them to. And for one suspended second, I watched that old machinery of hers try to engage. Marcus set down his fork with a small, deliberate clink of silver on china and said in the smooth, conflict-averse voice of a man who had spent his career smoothing over other people's discomfort, "Claire, maybe we sit down and talk about this after, Let's not make Diane's birthday about, well, whatever this is." whatever this is. I turned my head slowly and looked at him, and I did not raise my voice, but something in my expression must have carried more weight than I intended, because he actually stopped talking mid-sentence and reached for his water glass instead, suddenly very interested in the ice cubes floating in it. My mother's cousin, the one I'd been discussing tomatoes with only 20 minutes earlier, had gone very still in her seat, her hand frozen halfway to her wine glass, watching the whole table the way you watch weather rolling in over water, uncertain yet whether to run for cover or simply wait it out. I want to tell you what that particular silence felt like, standing there at the head of that table, because I think it is the part of the story people understand least when they only hear it secondhand. It was not loud. Nobody was screaming. The string lights kept glowing their soft, steady gold along the length of the dock, and somewhere behind the house, a bug zapper clicked faintly every few seconds. And out on the water, a loon called once, low and mournful, the way loons do at dusk on a Michigan lake in July, indifferent to whatever was happening among the people gathered on the shore. The smell of citronella candles drifted across the table, mixed with the last traces of grilled chicken and the sweet, charred smell of marshmallows someone had already started roasting over a small fire pit near the water for the kids. It was, in every sensory way, still a party, and it was about to stop being one. My mother reached out and touched my arm, gently, her rings cold against my skin, and she said in a small, frightened voice I had rarely heard from her, "Claire, honey, what is going on? You're scaring me a little." I looked down at her, at 70 years old in her pale blue dress with a paper crown someone's grandchild had made her earlier that afternoon, still sitting slightly crooked on her head. And something in my chest ached, because I had never wanted to frighten her. I had only ever wanted to be seen by her. "I'm not trying to scare you, Mom," I said quietly, my hand covering hers for just a moment. "I'm trying to tell you the truth, and I know that's going to be uncomfortable for a minute before it's anything else. But I need you to trust me long enough to hear all of it." She looked at me for a long moment. This woman who had told a stranger decades earlier at a piano recital that my sister was really something, while I stood there having just finished playing Chopin. And something in her face, some old, buried recognition seemed to settle. And she nodded once and sat back in her chair. In that pause, that single suspended breath before I spoke again, an entire private reel of memory moved through me faster than I could have described it out loud. The way I understand now that drowning people are supposed to see their whole lives pass in front of them. Except I was not drowning. I was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, standing perfectly upright. I thought of Ruth, small and sharp-eyed in her narrow little house, saying, "There you are, the real one," every single time I walked through her door. I thought of my father's note, folded soft at the creases in the bottom of my bag at that very moment. For Claire, who kept this standing when nobody else was looking. I thought of Emma in the back seat of my car 3 weeks earlier, asking me in that small, careful voice whether we were poor, and then asking me, later that same night with the star-shaped nightlight burning in the corner of her room, why I let them treat us like we were. I thought of her again just now, sitting 3 chairs down from me with her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, watching her mother the way she'd watched me since the day her father died. Like I was the one steady thing in a world that had already once proven it could disappear without warning. Vanessa tried one more time to reclaim the room. And I want to describe exactly how she did it, because it is such a perfect, distilled example of the way she had operated my entire life. She laughed, a short, bright, performative laugh, and looked around at the guests with an expression of amused, indulgent patience, the exact expression she'd used 100 times over the years whenever I said something she wanted the room to dismiss. "Okay, well, this is dramatic," she said, to nobody and everybody at once. A little chuckle threaded through it, like she was inviting the table to chuckle along with her. "Claire, I love you, but can we maybe not do whatever this is at Mom's 70th? I let that sentence sit in the air for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long at all. I looked at her, at the white linen dress, at the rosé still catching the string lights in her glass, at 30 years of exactly this particular tone aimed exactly at me. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I had spent my entire life being laughed past, dismissed with an indulgent little chuckle designed to make my own family's discomfort my problem to manage instead of hers. I was not going to manage it for her anymore. Todd shifted his weight beside me, and I felt, rather than saw, my brother finally, fully choose. He didn't say anything yet, that wasn't the plan, but he moved half a step closer to me, close enough that Vanessa could see it, close enough that everyone at that table could see it, and something in her face flickered, just slightly, the first small crack in 30 years of assumed authority. Priya, a step behind him, folded her hands in front of her and simply waited, steady, present, the way she'd promised she would be. I set my napkin down on the table, folded once, precisely, the way I used to fold invoices before filing them during those long nights rebuilding Daniel's company. And I let my eyes move slowly around the table, taking in every face one more time before I said what I had come there to say. My mother, frightened but listening. My father, still and steady, his eyes already wet, already, I think, grieving in advance for the version of this family that was about to end, and grateful in advance for whatever version came after it. Marcus, staring hard at his ice cubes. The guests, 40 of them, caught somewhere between wanting to look away and being unable to. And my daughter, 8 years old, chin up, watching her mother the way you watch someone you have already decided to believe in completely. Vanessa's glass was still raised, forgotten now, rosé catching the last of the gold evening light, her toast to the house hanging unfinished and suddenly, unmistakably ironic in the air above the table. To all of us who've worked so hard to keep it in the family, no matter what it takes. She had no idea yet what those words were about to cost her. And then, into the silence she herself had tried 3 times to fill, I answered her. "I know exactly where we are," I said. "I've thought about where we are for 3 weeks, since the last time this family gathered at this table, and my daughter was told, in front of everyone, that she gets chicken tenders because some of us have leftovers." A ripple moved through the guests. A few uncomfortable glances exchanged, my mother's cousin setting down her wine glass very quietly. I let that go that night. I've let a lot of things go, actually, for a long time, because I thought that was what love looked like in this family. Staying quiet, not making anyone uncomfortable, being the one who struggles so everyone else could feel a little more comfortable by comparison. I walked to the head of the table, where Todd rose quietly from his seat and stood beside me, Priya a step behind him, and I set the dark blue folder down in front of my mother. "Mom, I need you to open that." My mother looked at the folder, then at me, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the cover. Inside, 24 mortgage statements sat in neat chronological order, each one showing a payment of $3,000, each one drawn from an account under the name Whitmore Holdings. On top sat Arthur Blevins' letter, his careful legal language laying out in 3 short paragraphs exactly what I'd asked him to write. "That account is mine," I said, into the silence that had fallen over the entire dock. "It has been mine since I sold Daniel's company a year after he died, for a little over $1 million. A company I rebuilt myself, alone, at my kitchen table, while this family assumed I was drowning. Every one of those 24 payments came out of that account. $72,000 over 2 years is what it took to keep this house from going into foreclosure after Dad's investment went bad, and his stroke made it impossible for him to keep working. I have known about it since the week it almost happened, because Arthur called me, not because anyone in this family thought to." My mother's hand had gone to her mouth. My father, beside her, was nodding slowly, his eyes wet but steady. And I understood, watching him, that this part at least was not news to him, that he had simply been waiting, as quietly as I had, for the truth to find its own moment. Vanessa's face across the table had gone from confusion to something harder, something defensive, the particular expression of a person watching the ground shift beneath a story they'd built their whole identity on top of. Claire, that's not possible. That account, that has to be Mom and Dad's investments. That's what— There is no investment account, I said, and I let that land for a moment before I continued. There hasn't been meaningful money in that account since before Dad's stroke. Ask Arthur. I have his letter right here confirming everything, dated, notarized, on file. I looked at her directly now, and I felt something in me that had been coiled tight for 2 years finally, quietly, release. You told Priya and Todd at a barbecue I wasn't invited to that I'd never be able to help with the upkeep of this house anyway, so it wasn't like I was losing out on much. Do you remember saying that? The color drained from my sister's face in a way I will genuinely never forget. A slow, visible loss of certainty, like watching someone realize in real time that the floor they've been standing on their entire life was never actually load-bearing. I don't remember saying it exactly like— You said it exactly like that, Priya said quietly, stepping forward. I remember, because it upset me enough that I told Todd in the car. The table had gone completely, utterly silent. 40 guests frozen with drinks halfway to their mouths. My mother's book club friends exchanging glances that said, unmistakably, "We should not be here for this." I let the silence sit for a moment, because silence, I had learned, was often more powerful than any accusation. Then I said the part I had been rehearsing quietly in my head for 3 weeks, the part I needed my sister to hear in front of every witness on that dock. I also know about your calls to Arthur, Vanessa, about selling the house, about how quickly it could close, and how the proceeds would be divided based on who you called actually building something, which I understand now was your way of saying everyone but me. I kept my voice level, kept it quiet, kept it the exact opposite of the tone she'd used on me 3 weeks earlier over Lobster. You were planning to sell my father's home, without his knowledge, without Mom's full understanding of what she was agreeing to, and without so much as checking whether the person legally responsible for approving that sale would allow it. You didn't check, because you never imagined it could be me, because in your mind, I was never anything but leftovers. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed once, twice, no sound coming out, and beside her, Marcus had gone very quiet, watching his wife's careful public persona come apart in real time in front of 40 witnesses he presumably knew from country club dinners and charity boards. "I hold power of attorney for Dad," I continued. "Financial and medical, executed 2 years ago, the same week you and Todd both said you were too busy to take on the responsibility. That means no sale, no refinance, nothing happens to this house without my written consent. And as of tonight, that consent is not on the table. Not because I want to punish this family, because for 2 years I've watched what happens when I stay quiet to protect people who wouldn't do the same for me, and I am done doing that." I turned then, not to Vanessa, but to my mother, and my voice softened, because whatever else was true, she was still my mother, and I had not come to that dock to destroy her, only to be finally, fully seen by her. "Mom, I need you to understand something. I never told you about the payments because I didn't want gratitude. I wanted this family to still feel like a family, and I was afraid that if you knew, it would change how everyone treated each other, and not necessarily for the better. But watching what happened 3 weeks ago, watching my daughter get handed a basket of chicken tenders while being called leftovers in front of everyone she loves, I realized that my silence wasn't protecting this family anymore. It was protecting the story that let this family hurt her." My mother was crying now, openly, one hand still resting on the open folder, and she reached the other hand toward me, and I let her take it, because I had never wanted to hurt her, not once in any of this. "Claire," she said, her voice breaking, "I had no idea, I swear to you, I had no idea any of this was happening. Not the house, not what your sister said, none of it." "I know, Mom," I said quietly. "That's actually the whole problem. Nobody in this family ever really knew what was happening to me, because I never let you, and nobody ever asked." I stopped there for a second, because the next part was the part I had carried the longest. Daniel's grandmother told me something once, years ago, and I didn't understand it until I was 2 years into paying for this house. She said, "Being useful to people is not the same thing as being loved by them. This family has needed me for a long time, Mom. I'm still waiting to find out whether it loves me." Vanessa, finally finding her voice again, tried one more angle, and I watched her reach for it the way a drowning person reaches for anything at all. "This is insane. This is completely... You're standing up at Mom's birthday and making this into some kind of performance, Claire. This isn't the time or the place." "You made a public comment about my daughter's worth at a family dinner in front of everyone she loves," I said, and for the first time all evening, I let a little heat into my voice. Just enough, just once. You don't get to decide there's a wrong time or place for the truth to come out, after choosing the most public possible stage to humiliate an 8-year-old over the price of dinner. I learned that particular lesson from you, actually. I'm just delivering it back." There was a long, ringing silence after that, the kind that seems to physically press down on a gathering, and into it, unexpectedly, my father spoke. His voice was slower than it used to be, the words coming with careful effort, but every one of them landed with total clarity. "Vanessa," he said, "sit down." Just that, 2 words, from a man who rarely raised his voice even before the stroke, and something about the quiet finality of it made my sister actually obey, sinking back into her chair like the air had gone out of her. My father looked around the table, at all of us, and then at me, and his eyes were wet, but his voice, for those next few sentences, was steadier than I'd heard it since before the stroke. "This house is standing because of my daughter Claire," he said. "It has been standing because of her for 2 years, while the rest of us called her the one who struggles. I've known for a while. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." He reached out and took my hand, the one not still holding my mother's, and for one long moment, on that dock, under those string lights, with 40 stunned witnesses watching, I stood between my two parents, finally, fully known. Emma, who had been sitting very still and very quiet through all of it, slipped out of her chair and came to stand beside me too, slipping her small hand into mine, and I looked down at her, and she looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts frightened and fiercely proud, and I squeezed her hand and thought, This is what 3 weeks of quiet architecture was actually for. I would love to tell you the story ended there, on that warm, tearful, vindicated note, but the truth, and I promised you the truth, is that grief and pride and shame don't collapse all at once just because the facts have changed. What happened over the next hour was messier than the moment of the reveal itself, and I think it's worth telling honestly, because real reckonings are rarely clean. Vanessa did not simply apologize and sit quietly with her shame. She tried, for a good 10 minutes, several different strategies. First, anger, insisting I'd humiliated her deliberately, that I could have told her privately instead of in front of 40 guests, conveniently forgetting that she had chosen the exact same public stage 3 weeks earlier to humiliate my daughter. I told her, calmly, that I had considered telling her privately and had decided against it because private conversations with Vanessa over the years had a long track record of being denied, reframed, or simply forgotten the next morning, and that some truths, unfortunately, only stick when there are witnesses. Then she tried minimizing, insisting the lobster comment had just been a joke, that I was being oversensitive, that everyone knew she loved Emma. I looked at her for a long moment and asked her, quietly, to repeat, right now, in front of everyone still seated at that table, the exact words she'd said to the caterer 3 weeks earlier. She wouldn't. Couldn't, maybe. The silence where that answer should have been told its own story. Finally, watching the faces around her, watching Marcus's carefully composed discomfort, watching our mother's tears, watching our father's steady, disappointed gaze, something in Vanessa seemed to actually break, not performatively, but genuinely, and she put her face in her hands and said, muffled, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about the money. I always assumed that you needed help, and I think somewhere along the way, it just felt easier to believe that than to ask you how you were actually doing. It was, I think, the closest thing to an honest sentence my sister had said to me in years, and I let it sit there, unanswered, for a while, because I did not owe her instant forgiveness just because she'd finally found a true thing to say. I told her, eventually, that I believed her, that I didn't think she'd set out 3 years ago to build her whole identity on my smallness, but that somewhere along the way, it had become convenient for her. And convenience, left unchecked, curdles into cruelty faster than people like to admit. I told her I needed time before I trusted her around my daughter again, and that trust, going forward, was going to have to be earned in private, ordinary, unglamorous ways, not performed at parties. Todd, for what it's worth, finally found his spine that night in a way I don't think he'd ever fully found it before. He stood up in front of the whole family and said, plainly, that he'd been avoiding conflict his entire life, and that his silence over the years had let Vanessa's version of me become the only version anyone in the family bothered to know, and that he was done being quiet just to keep the peace when the peace wasn't actually fair to anyone. Priya squeezed his hand, and I watched my brother, for the first time in decades, look like a person standing up straight instead of ducking sideways. My mother spent a long time that evening simply holding my hands, apologizing in the particular repetitive way people apologize when the guilt is too large to fit into one sentence. And eventually, I told her, gently, that I didn't need her to apologize 100 times. I needed her, going forward, to actually ask me how I was doing, and believe the answer, instead of assuming the easiest story about her struggling daughter. She promised. I have, in the months since, watched her genuinely try. And trying, from my mother, at 70 years old, is its own kind of quiet miracle. As for the house itself, I want to tell you what I decided, because I think it matters more than the confrontation did. I did not let it go into disrepair as some kind of punishment, and I did not simply keep paying quietly and invisibly the way I had for 2 years either. I sat down with Arthur Blevins the following week and restructured the ownership properly, formally, with everyone's full knowledge this time. My parents remained the legal owners, but I established a small family trust, funded by the remainder of what I'd earned from Daniel's company, specifically earmarked to cover the mortgage and upkeep of the lake house going forward, administered transparently, with statements sent to every adult in the family twice a year, so that no one would ever again be able to claim ignorance about who was keeping the lights on. I did it not for credit, though I won't pretend the credit didn't feel good after 2 years of invisibility. I did it because that house was worth saving, and because I wanted my daughter to grow up understanding that the people who quietly hold a family together deserve to be seen doing it, not discovered doing it by accident at a birthday party. 3 months after that night, we gathered again at Blackwater Lake, a smaller, quieter gathering, just my parents, Todd's family, and Emma and me. No caterer, no $200 lobster, just a simple dinner my mother cooked herself, roast chicken and green beans and a pie Emma helped make, and around that same dock table, in the warm gold evening light, my father raised his glass, slower now, more careful with his words than he used to be, and said, "To Claire, who this family should have thanked a long time ago, and who I am never going to stop thanking again." Emma, sitting beside me, leaned over at some point during that dinner and whispered, "Mom, this is way better than lobster." And she was right. It was. Vanessa was there too, that night, quieter than I'd ever seen her, helping clear plates without being asked, sitting for a long while afterward on the dock with Emma, patiently, genuinely, teaching her how to skip stones the way I hadn't quite mastered myself. It wasn't instant forgiveness. It was something slower and more honest than that. The long, unglamorous work of 2 sisters learning to actually see each other for the first time in 30 years. We are not close the way people in movies suddenly become close after a single dramatic confrontation. But we are honest now, in a way we never were before. And honesty, it turns out, is a much sturdier foundation for a family than performance ever was. I think about that 4th of July dinner often, the tray of lobsters coming out one by one, my daughter's small basket of chicken tenders, the word my sister used, so easily, so publicly, without a second thought. Leftovers. I have come to believe that word says far more about the person who uses it than the person it's aimed at. My family looked at me for 2 years and saw someone with nothing left to give, when in truth, I had been quietly giving everything, every single month, without asking for a single word of thanks. If there is a lesson in this, and I believe there is, it isn't really about money, or lobster, or even about my sister's particular cruelty. It's about what happens when we let the people we love keep believing a small, convenient story about who we are. Because the truth feels too heavy, or too exposing, or simply too much trouble to correct. Silence can be an act of love for a while. But eventually, if it goes on long enough, it stops protecting the people around you and starts protecting the very story that's hurting you. I learned, at 42 years old, standing on a dock under string lights with a folder full of mortgage statements, that being useful is not the same thing as being loved, and that being underestimated is not the same thing as being safe, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for the people who love you and for the ones who don't quite manage to yet is to finally, calmly, let them see you exactly as you are. My daughter will never again wonder whether her mother's love or her mother's strength comes with an asterisk attached. She watched me stand up on that dock, and she has told me since, more than once, in the plain, clear way children say the truest things, that she wants to be like me when she grows up, steady and quiet, and, when it finally matters, completely unafraid to be seen. Have you ever had to sit at your own family's table and swallow something you didn't deserve, waiting for the right moment to finally set it down? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, wherever you're watching this from tonight. And if this one meant something to you, if it reminded you even a little of your own quiet strength, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe, so the next story like this one finds you too.